The economic prescription that doesn't kill the patient, and this is how wars are started. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 2nd of September 2022. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robbie Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Elisa.
On today's show, we're going to be talking about the austerity policy being dictated by central bankers and the alternatives that will actually fix the problem. And then we'll talk about an example of a very egregious, flat-out lie that came through the Australian media recently, which is exactly the nature of how wars are started. Now, don't forget, if you like the show, hit the like button, subscribe and ring the notification bell so that you're alerted of new shows and other extras that we put up. And share this as widely as you can. Comment below. All of those things help get this a wider circulation. Now, before we start...
Yes, I just wanted to... I've announced this on the show before, but it's D-Day next week, so remind the viewers, on Wednesday, the 7th of September, which is next Wednesday, today's Friday morning, there will be a public post office bank forum at Parliament House, and it goes from midday, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m, so just for 1 hour. It's hosted by the Licensed Post Office Group, and it'll be the host there will be Angela Cramp, who's the Executive Director, and there'll be representatives of the Licensed Post Office Group there. The featured speaker is Matt Robson, the former Cabinet Minister of New Zealand, who I've interviewed on our Citizens Insight program on New Zealand's postal bank, which is Kiwi Bank. So we've brought Matt Robson over to address this forum and hold meetings with members of Parliament. And it'll be addressed by other members of Parliament who support the proposal, including Bob Katter, who will introduce the bill. And we're hoping to have actually quite a few members of Parliament, broadly representative of a cross-section of the Parliament. So this is seen to be bipartisan, which it actually is. The difference is, Elisa, while there's bipartisan support, they're not leading on it. The leaders on this campaign have to be the people of Australia to demand that they act on it, and then politicians will respond. So what we need the viewer to do is, in the next week, contact your Member of Parliament, and that we'll have the link to our press release with instructions on our website on this. Contact your Member of Parliament. Also, please look up the senators in your state and send them an email and give them a call as well, and tell them you support the Postal Bank and they should send someone along to this forum, either the Member of Parliament themselves or a staff member, a representative of their staff, so that they get this briefing firsthand on how this proposal will work, right? This is the education part of the campaign. Everything we do, the success we have in our campaigns, starts with supporters making those calls, sending those emails, motivating their members of Parliament, right? This is really, really crucial. So, and just one last thing is the venue will be the Senate Committee Room 2S3. All right, so that's on the that'll be on the press release when you click on it, and make sure you get that information to them as well. But really, please make those calls.
Yes. Now on to our first topic, the economic prescription that doesn't kill the patient. So we've seen this before in history where in a financial crisis you hit the phenomenon sometimes of inflation, and central bankers usually are the ones that tell governments, okay, in order to get this under control so we can keep the stability of the all-important financial system, priority number one is maintain our financial order, you're going to have to cut or crush economic growth because we need to rein in that inflation and achieve price stability. Now we're seeing it again today, and we've just had over the 25th to the 27th of August the annual gathering of various central bankers from the world's most prominent central banks, IMF and other major financial institutions held in Wyoming, Jackson Hole. And at that event, the head of the Fed, the US Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has stated that He's going to continue to raise interest rates, including with another 0.75% rise in September, and continuing as long as is necessary to achieve that price stability, even though, as he admitted, it will bring some pain to households and businesses. And the Fed president of the Richmond Federal Reserve, Thomas Barkin, added to that assessment that the Fed must curb inflation even if it causes a recession. Jerome Powell invoked the Fed chairman, who was the first Fed chairman at the time when this Jackson Hole summit started to become a regular thing, Paul Volcker, who faced similar, massive upsurge of inflation through the 1970s. And of course, he raised interest rates to 21.5%. He told a congressional committee in October 1979, he said, "The standard of living of the average American has to decline. I don't think you can escape that." And then after that came to pass, and you had a collapse of small businesses, manufacturing, construction, everything being smashed, he told the Wall Street Journal, "I'm not sorry about it. I don't know any other course of action that would have been politically feasible or economically feasible." And that is the point we really want to make. There is an alternative to this monetary nonsense. Now, Jackson Hole, at the point when Volcker was making those kind of interventions, became at that point, because this was on the tail of the destruction of the Bretton Woods financial arrangements, which was an agreement set up at the end of World War II that nations, in order to facilitate trade, to get countries rebuilt after the war and so forth, would agree to a certain set of arrangements that were standardised across the board, integrated sort of framework that would facilitate trade and put speculation on the back burner. Now, when that was dismantled, starting in 1971, when the US president announced they would be taking the link between gold and the US dollar away, getting rid of that, a new era of mammoth speculation began. And a whole series of phase changes ensued from that point, which included the destruction of Glass-Steagall by 1999, which meant that banks that were protected by government deposit insurance, could gamble with people's deposits and people's money and get bailed out for it. But fast forwarding through until more currently, Jackson Hole has been the scene of many a crime and a major conduit for major financial phase changes, such as, most prominently, as we've reported in our Australian Alert Service weekly newsletter, the financial regime change that was discussed in 2019, whereby central banks would be given even greater reins to control not only monetary policies we're talking about with interest rates, but to control fiscal policy, which means the decisions on where governments direct their spending. A global digital currency, which was proposed by Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, in 2019 at Jackson Hole. A new green speculative bubble, which would include new financial instruments, new forms of speculation, new regulations and taxes, which would again constrain the real economy. And of course, later that year, when the so-called repo crisis, which was the seizing up of short-term money markets, occurred, this led to some of those things that were discussed at Jackson Hole coming to pass, including entirely new bailout mechanisms. And there's an article I urge people to read about this, about how the Fed was given powers to even override the Congress and make laws regarding these new kind of bailouts, which was published by Wall Street on Parade, and we ran it in our newsletter recently. But the point here being that this is being presented as a fait accompli. The financial system comes first. In order to protect it, we're going to have to crush the economy, temporarily suppress growth, etc. No, that's not the only way.
I think what you're saying, Elisa, in that historical description is the economy has been disappearing down the Jackson Hole, and let me let me also cover the same period of history, because it does go back to Bretton Woods. Because what Bretton Woods was 44 to 71, it was an agreement, and the connection between the US dollar and gold was important. That peg was important because every other currency was pegged to the US dollar. And the purpose of that was so that there was stability, people could see the value, you could recognise where value was in everyone's economy, right? Now, when it was flexible, if a country fell into short-term problems, say like a famine in an African country, right? Which would, a famine in an African country would really devastate that country's economy. The purpose of the IMF was to give them a loan, to tide them over, to support their currency, to keep their currency at this even peg to the dollar, right? So that they didn't have, inflationary problems and those sort of things. If the pressures got too bad, there was an ability for countries to revalue their currency, and you could reset what the currency would be, and the whole world knew that. And so there was a transparency, and that's what allowed the system to take place. But think about what inflation is. Inflation is when money, which is a claim on goods and services, increases, but goods and services don't increase, right? And there's more money chasing fewer goods and services. There's two reasons for inflation. One is an increase in more money. Two is a breakdown in the production of goods and services. And the way the parameters of Bretton Woods worked is it provided an incentive for government policymakers in each country because they wanted to, it was good to maintain the stability of the system, for government policymakers in each country to make sure that they were investing in the things that kept them productive, right? And guess what? The 2.5 decades after World War II was the period of greatest productivity growth in the history of the world because of those parameters. But why did it collapse? Because the Brits actually, in the city of London, who was the only country, there were 44 countries to vote on the Bretton Woods Agreement. The final vote was 43-1. The one no vote was Great Britain, led by John Maynard Keynes. What did the Brits do in the 60s? They started to allow gold speculation, which was essentially illegal. They started to allow gold speculation in London, and that ended up weakening the system. Now, think about this. The Bretton Woods ended in 71, right? Volcker is 79. That's only 8 years. If we were talking to our 10-year-old son, 8 years is a long time. To me, the global financial crisis was yesterday, right? That's 14 years ago now. That was a very short period of time. And the reason Volcker had this inflation problem was because of the collapse of Bretton Woods. That was the reason, right? But instead of recognising that, hang on, we lost our way badly, we need to go back to a Bretton Woods system so that we get production in the economy again, they took this approach where the premise is the whole free market idea, or the market itself idea, that only the market makes wise financial decisions, not governments, not people who make investment, not who decide national investment strategies, just the market. And so it's the buying power of the public just doing what they want to do that directs where an economy goes. So there's too much buying power, we have to crush that. Knowing, in their own quotes, they're talking about crushing people's living standards, right? Because they didn't want to go back to something where governments had more say because they had agreed to a set of rules like Bretton Woods. That worked! The greatest productivity growth in the history of the world. Guess what's happened ever since Bretton Woods went down? We have had 4 or 5 decades of economists saying, why can't we get productivity up? Why can't we get productivity up? I mean, China's got it up, but we try and try, we can't get productivity up. Yeah, because you're not investing.
And look at the rate of banking collapses,
yes,
having increased, with the Glass-Steagall system, which prevented speculation, you had virtually none. And then after that, a massive
it's the financial sector that has essentially benefited from this insane proposal. But you've got to think of the financial sector as like a mafia. And who does the mafia kill the most? Not their customers. They kill each other, right? They don't mind knocking each other off, but the mafia stays in power, right? That's the main thing. And the bottom line is what they don't want is law enforcement, i.e. government, to come in and make sure the
the
right things
outside.
are done for the people.
Yeah.
So we have to have a system, which leads us into what we're about to talk
Yes,
about,
we're bringing-
to get investment into the economy. That's
Bringing
the prescription.
bringing the law enforcement to town.
We are.
Through a postal bank, and it's
comes
going to
the
be
sheriff.
everywhere. Wherever there's a post office, there's going to be the law enforcement because
The sheriff is coming, or the marshal, as in the movie Tombstone, Wyatt Earp said, "You tell them I'm coming and I'm bringing hell with me."
so the local post office manager, get ready for that role. No,
Yeah.
it won't be that hard. But speaking of, every town, we want to play a clip here because getting into our discussion and the latest developments on our campaign for a postal bank. Last week we showed a clip from Channel 7, I think it was, which showed the town of Blackwater that has lost their banks, and we want to now show...
Where the NAB is helping by having the bank open for 3 hours a week.
On 1 day a week. But now we're going to show another clip, and thank you to Wayne Ditchburn for sending us these clips, by the way. Very, very useful, and this is obviously happening all over the place and we won't see all the reports of it, but it just gives the colour to the reality that people on the ground are facing in so many of these towns. So this video is about Dalgety, which is, I think, New South Wales, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a town in the foot of the snowy mountains in New South Wales.
So we're just going to roll this clip which shows you what that town is facing.
Nearby communities are worried they are being left out. The tiny town of Dalgety is a 20-minute drive away, but it's losing essential services. The local public school, the post office and its only cafe all closed this year.
It's a bit devastating, really. We always had the little shop, you could meet friends there for a cuppa, and with the school gone, there's nothing really left in the town.
Further south, Bombala is also under pressure. The town is at risk of losing its only GP clinic after their aged care home closed in April.
It is pretty hard to keep things running and nothing's guaranteed.
The plan to grow the region is capitalising on strong migration to the area since the COVID-19 pandemic. Land value in Jindabyne went up by 100% last year. It's the highest increase in the state.
It was unexpected, and regional areas are struggling with that a little bit in terms of infrastructure, housing.
Many rural towns across Australia are dealing with similar challenges, but it appears the sense of community in these regions is one of the biggest reasons why people choose to stay. Smaller communities wanting to be included in the big picture. Kira Proust, ABC News, Dalgety.
All right, so, there's actual they said their post office had shut down, and there are, as we've been saying for the last couple of years, many local post offices that can't survive economically. So especially when the whole town is dying, that's going to be a major factor. That if you've already lost the major banks and people say, oh, but we've got bank at post. Well, not necessarily, because the post offices have to remain viable. And
in this particular case, I had a good chat to Wayne because he lives not that far from this town of Dalgety. The essence of the problem is the town is dying, right? And because now that it's so extreme, the local post office outlet has shut. The people of Dalgety have to travel 50 kilometres to Cooma to get their mail. Instead of having a postal outlet in Dalgety where one mail truck or whatever comes from Cooma and the people of Dalgety just all go to that one post office. Now they've all got to make separately the trip to Cooma, and as I pointed out to a Green politician who I was talking to about this bank proposal, who's supportive, I said, think about the carbon dioxide emissions, right? That's one little example.
Yeah, not to mention economic inefficiency, etc.
If Elisa, the post office was a bank, that was not just taking deposits like Bank at Post did, but investing in the local community, right? That community would not be dying. The local governance people, like the local councils in charge of that area, could be saying, hang on, boy, if Dalgety had this piece of infrastructure, I don't know what it would be, right? But every local area knows what they need. If Dalgety had this piece of infrastructure, if we could just build something like that, it would attract the activity, the industry back to the town to keep the town alive, right? And that's what a postal bank can do. And we've just made we should do a call out to that. We've just made a video on this, how a postal bank could actually help local government, local council. You and I did a show on this a few weeks ago. Help, or was it Richard and I?
I think it was Richard.
Okay, sorry about that. Richard and I did a show on this a couple of weeks ago. How help local government from an investment standpoint. Be an investment bank for local government, right? And do those sort of things and stop the depopulation of rural Australia. That's a big problem. Get the populations growing again, and you reverse the downward spiral.
Now, of course, we've been urging people to take this idea to everyone in their community, from their MP down to the local councils. And we've just had another council, which is the 4th council now, that has voted up a resolution with a 6-4 vote in Cobar, New South Wales. This
Cobar
is
Shire Council.
South of Bourke, west of Dubbo, out there. And of course, they have big problems, like all such towns, with banks leaving. So the other councils that have passed this was the Banana Shire Council, passed it unanimously in Queensland. Narrabri passed it unanimously, with Wee Waa having recently lost both of their banks. And similar story to what you were telling with Dalgety, businesses would have to give employees 1 to 2 hours to go and do the banking. So they send off an employee that could be working to drive a 1 to 2 hour round trip by the time they get everything done, wait in the queue, etc., and come back. There's not even an ATM in that local town. So that's also New South Wales. And the other town that recently passed a resolution was Yilgarn in Western Australia, which lost its last 2 major bank branches and is dependent on the post office for day-to-day banking. Again, a 2-hour drive to the nearest bank branch of a major bank, and the councillors there unanimously supported the resolution also. What we want to do is show a clip, though, just to give again the flavour of how this works, and to motivate you to go to your local council, because they'll have a discussion. These are all the issues that are on their plate anyway.
I want to say what we're about to play. This is like a major event in a Citizens Party report. This is a fairly lengthy clip, but what you're going to see is the entire debate of the Cobar Shire Council, because they have some process to film these things and put them online. You're going to see the entire debate of the Cobar Shire Council. It doesn't go that long, but it's a bit of a long clip for us. And there is a debate, because it didn't pass. This is one that didn't pass unanimously, and some of the councillors put up certain objections. Some were based on a misunderstanding, right? Apparently there was. Some people might have had connections to the one local bank in town or whatever, but that's okay. They had a discussion, right? And the end result, though, was the Cobar Shire Council passing the resolution. And as you said, this is what we need to be replicated all around Australia, which the viewer is in charge of. That's your job, to take it to your local council and say, discuss this resolution and act on it. But anyway, watch a little bit of how democracy at the grassroots level works in action.
Next is the mayoral minute, which since I wrote it, I might remove it. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Payne. Now, the reason for this mayoral minute was driven home to me at in the Empire Hotel, believe it or not. And they had just got a new cook who came from Morong. I overheard him telling another patron that Morong had a Commonwealth Bank and that was closed and left them with banking either at Orange or at Wellington. Now, I believe that Bob Catter is going to move a motion in the Federal House to put forward the Commonwealth Postal Savings Bank bill. And I believe this will help those who are least able to help themselves, the pensioners, etc., and keep cash available for various users. It has a secondary effect in that it also sort of eases the push for digital money and the next step on the social credit system, which I think is both are very bad for the country as a whole, let alone freedom. Anyhow, that's the reason for the mayoral minute. Any objections? Anybody want to speak against it? Yes. Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I'm good on you for having a crack at it, I say, but most of the banks, as you say, have got an affiliation with Australia Post now and offer the bank at post. Being in the bank, we do advise our customers on how to bank elsewhere, always suggesting you've got online banking and things. I see you're concerned about cash and the elderly and vulnerable people. Well, you know what, we'd be far better lobbying the banks to keep the branches open rather than going for a Commonwealth post office. We have the facility Australia Post, which is not too bad. They're adding to it all the time. The latest one is that you can now get cash and coin at the bank. To me, the training you have to go through to handle banking is quite extensive, and I just feel that we do not need a Commonwealth banking at post. We had a Commonwealth bank once, and what did we do? Privatised it. It's just double Dutch to me, and I won't support the motion, I'm sorry. I just think we should lobby the banks to keep their branches open in the country area, which we push very hard now with the executives of the National Bank all the time saying leave them open because people need this, the older people need the services.
Wasn't there a case made in one of the towns where they'd actually...
Sorry, Councillor. Sorry, it's Councillor Maxwell first. Leave your green light on. Leave it on.
Councillor Maxwell.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. In reply to Councillor Payne's comments, I support the mayoral minute mostly because it's possibly not going to actually establish another bank, but it may force the current banks to fulfil their community service and customer service obligations, and that's the useful thing I think it might do.
Thank you, Councillor Maxwell. Councillor Simpson.
Wasn't there one of the other towns where they were closing their bank? There was a business case and everything put forward that proved that the bank should stay, and they closed it anyway. So, you know, the banks are, most of the banks are just bastards. And, you know, we're going to, you know, be at their mercy. I think an alternative should be sought, and I agree with Councillor Maxwell that perhaps by doing this, it may make the banks wake up. But I don't hold that much hope.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Councillor Payne.
Question? Can't talk twice there.
Oh, can I just finish off what I had to say? That while looking to put something else in, it could be the last nail in the coffin for the local branches. You start introducing something else, you could just add to the reason why they won't have local branches in the towns.
Right reply.
Yeah, well, I've got
Right reply or put the motion.
I think I'll just put the motion. Those in favour? Carried.
So the more of that we have, and of course that resolution, it includes sending the demand to the federal members of parliament to vote for this bill that Bobcat is putting up for a post office bank.
So they pass the resolution to support it and to write to their local member of parliament, right? And so, Elisa, next week I'm going to be in parliament, meeting with members of parliament, and it's so invaluable for me to know that the public out there are doing that and councils are doing that.
Now, I just want to give a couple of examples, again, to encourage people to keep doing this, because we just received an email from a councillor in Queensland who said, he wrote to us, we didn't initiate this, saying he's been lobbying his federal member for the postal bank. So when we get those messages, that is fantastic. We've got activists now that are forwarding responses from, written by their members of parliament. One, for example, who said he will try to attend this forum that you're holding next Wednesday, who said he agrees in principle with post office banks and is eager to see more details as this proposal progresses, and will try to get to the forum. And also a real shout out to one of our supporters, Hazel, who has called all the councils in her area, emailed them all, sent them all personal letters with our information, and is calling, called the leader of the National Party and various other MPs as well. And that kind of work goes just, from handfuls of people, goes a very long way, and the more we can multiply that, the better it will be.
Before we move on, I just want to go back to the clip, because there was a couple of things I intended to say about it. One was the misunderstanding is the difference between bank at post, which is you can already do your banking at the post office, and what we're proposing of a postal bank. And the difference is banking at the post office to banking with the post office, right? We're talking about a dedicated postal bank. What Bank at Post does not do is increase competition in the banking system. It is purely an agency for the existing private banks. That's all it is, right? And unfortunately, it has a big downside, which is that they exploit that service. They exploited it for years, and I did the interview last year with Angela Cramp from the LPO group, who will be hosting our forum next week, where she described how these banks just didn't pay properly for the fact that Australia Post was serving their customers.
Doing all the work.
And it was costing Australia Post $50 million a year, and most of that was coming out of the pockets of the small business people who run the licensed post offices, right? So they're going to shut it down, but Christine Holgate came along and said, no, we can't shut it down. 1,500 communities around Australia would lose all banking services if we shut this down. What we have to do is get the banks to pay more, and she did, and she landed the best deal in Australia Post history. So grateful was she landing the deal for the assistance she got from 4 executives. She gave them gold watches, and 2 years later that was used to, in this contrived scandal to destroy her, or at least to destroy her as a CEO of Australia Post. Since she's been gone, the banks that did the deal have renewed the deal, but for less money. They're already squeezing Australia Post again. You can have no confidence the banks remain committed to this service. If they pull out, they can pull out any time they like. If they do, those communities are abandoned again. And there's no equivalent of Christine Holgate inside Australia Post anymore to fight for them, right? Whereas, if you had a dedicated, what we're talking about is the government setting up a bank, and that bank has one outlet, post offices. The government owns the bank, the government owns the post offices, right? And then the bank will sign an agreement with the post office, with Australia Post, so that it pays Australia Post properly for using its outlets. And those payments are structured to benefit Australia Post and the licensed post offices, right? And what you're doing is, by the bank being able to use the post offices, it can provide banking services as cheaply as possible. By the post offices being able to serve, be agents for the bank and properly paid for it, it supports the ongoing provision of postal services around Australia. Because there's pressure on those services as well. This is what you call win-win. And the other benefit is it makes the banks compete. The existing banks will have to compete. That's the difference that people don't understand, sometimes don't understand. What are you talking about? I can already do. No, we're talking about a dedicated postal bank. We will be aware of that. We've got literature about it. Talk to your local councils about it, but this is something that can be explained.
And that win-win extends to governments because, as we saw with the Commonwealth Bank, New Zealand saw with Bank of New Zealand, banks are very profitable, even if they're run on a sound and good and fair basis.
Yeah.
They still make a lot of profit. And in terms of the way this can also funnel money into local government, state government, federal government budgets and infrastructure and so forth, as you said, win-win-win.
And that's it. Just quickly, the other thing that gets raised is, we already have community banks. You know, like Bendigo Bank has this thing where people have community banks. It's not the same thing at all, right? Again, that is just that's you know, admirably, a local community has raised the money to make sure they still have a banking service. It's actually Bendigo or whatever that gets all the benefits of their deposits. Bendigo makes the loans. The local community doesn't benefit from that. But I'll tell you something about community banks. They're all profitable. They actually pay dividends to the local communities because bank branches are profitable. When banks are shutting down branches and saying, they're not profitable, they're lying. They're just not profitable enough, right? And one of the examples, Bendigo says, we invest in community infrastructure. Councillors have told us this. Bendigo invests in community infrastructure. Yeah, I looked up their website. Australia-wide, it's about $10 million a year. That's great for Bendigo. Hats off to Bendigo for doing that. We're talking about a bank that can do that on a much bigger... $10 million a year Australia-wide is peanuts. You can have a bank that invests in infrastructure, local government infrastructure, community infrastructure around Australia for billions a year, right? That's what you need.
And of course, when I referred to the Commonwealth and to Bank of New Zealand, I meant before they were privatised, we saw, what they were capable of doing. But on that note, there's some interesting shifts taking place in New Zealand at the moment in this banking landscape, complete banking desert. There's governments are propelled to try to do something about it. And last week we mentioned that there was a development on the Kiwi Bank front, which we wanted to talk about a little more. And that is that on the 22nd of August, the New Zealand Finance Minister Grant Robertson announced that the government has acquired 100% of Kiwi Bank's parent company, Kiwi Group Holdings, ensuring the bank remains fully Kiwi owned. Now, just the background to that, because Kiwi Bank obviously was already government owned, but it was owned by government agencies, New Zealand Post, New Zealand Super Fund and ACC, which is the Crown Insurance Agency. But those agencies run as commercial enterprises and were making a push to sell some of their shares to private companies or banks. And the former...
Which would have been a partial privatisation of Kiwi Bank.
By stealth, exactly. Now, the former New Zealand Cabinet Minister, who you mentioned earlier, who's going to be in Australia to talk about the Postal Bank because he has a background in working to set up Kiwi Bank with Jim Anderton, who was the key politician who got it through. He said that this decision that's been taken by the New Zealand government is very good in that it is now 100% owned directly by the government with no intermediation. He also referenced what the Finance Minister Robertson stated in that he said the transaction ensures Kiwi Bank remains 100% Kiwi owned. The new ownership structure simplifies our ability to fully support Kiwi Bank to meet its future potential, which is a key thing.
Very important.
It says the government is fully committed to supporting Kiwi Bank to be a genuine competitor in the banking industry, ensuring the bank has access to capital to continue to grow on a commercially sustainable basis and offer a viable and competitive alternative for New Zealanders.
No, this is so what Matt Robson is saying, this is actually a positive development, right? That the government of New Zealand is faced with... I'll tell you what's actually happened here. There's been this pressure that's eroded Kiwi Bank over time. Subsequent governments were not as supportive of it as the government that Matt was in that set it up. One of them was run by a banker, right? So John Key. But private bankers do not like to compete with public banks. So they've been plotting for ages. How can we get rid of this? How can we get rid of this? Here's New Zealand Post and these other agencies saying we want to sell Kiwi Bank, and the government had the perfect excuse. So why didn't they take it? Because the public won't let them. This is the bottom line. Public banks are popular. Why? Because the same public knows what the private banks are like. right? And even something that was really early on very good and has been eroded somewhat, the New Zealand public still support it. And so the government says, okay, we are going to let it off the leash. We're going to support it to compete with the private banks. And you know what those private banks are, Elisa? They're our banks. Commonwealth, ANZ, National Australia Bank and Westpac. They're the subsidiaries they own in New Zealand.
And I wanted to mention, we said Jim Anderton set up Kiwi Bank, and you can read more about it in our latest Australian Alert Service, and we've talked about it in greater detail in the past, because he spent 13 years on basically alone, a single voice in the wilderness, pushing for a People's Post Office bank of some format, and eventually got it instituted in 2002. But when he gave a speech in 1988, when the government decided they were going to privatise the Bank of New Zealand, which had been a public bank since 1861, and he pointed out in that speech was very profitable for the government, he said, and this is what I think is hopeful, that could be reflected in the words of Grant Robertson, the Finance Minister, in what he spoke about pulling out the full potential of Kiwi Bank. Anderson said that the Bank of New Zealand, instead of being privatised, could be given the task of providing long-term development funds for viable projects in all of the regions. So he very much had that same concept as we're pushing today for our Post Office People's Bank.
A bank that can do investment.
That's right, and that's what we desperately need. That's the alternative to crushing austerity.
That's right. What is the prescription that doesn't kill the patient? You've got to invest. If you're worried about inflation, invest in productivity. And what we're talking about, and spent the last 20 minutes talking about, is the institutions that do that, right? And public banks are first and foremost among those institutions ever since Alexander Hamilton conceived of them 200 plus years ago.
Yep, so on to our next topic, I think. This is how wars are started.
Well, we're running out of time, so we'll keep this brief, but we've got a hell of a clip that I want people to watch and own, because this is when I mean own, this is about Australian media, but when the Australian media do what you're about to see in this clip, they're doing it because they think you want them to do it. They think that they're giving you what you want. That's how the tabloid media especially works. Rupert Murdoch has totally destroyed standards in media all around the world. And every time, whenever he's been criticised for it, he says, don't be a snob, I'm giving the public what they want. That's their excuse. So we're saying this is how wars are started, because we're about to show you a lie, an outright lie. But before we do, I just want to mention another lie that we can't deal with today, because it's topical in the news. Yesterday, the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, released her report on what China's doing in Xinjiang to Uyghurs, to the Uyghur Muslims there, right? And, everybody who's regular on our show knows that we have been debunking these claims for a long time. This report, on the face of it, is damning to China. The Human Rights Commissioner says they may be committing crimes against humanity up there in Xinjiang. A couple of weeks ago, Elisa, I went to a forum, as we know, and I tried to ask a question and got shut down, and I've been slandered for it ever since. And it's actually got quite intense, the blowback I've received from trying to do this. But the people that I asked the question of are the people who've been whipping up a lot of anti-China stuff in Australia, right? So anyway, enough of that. What I'm about to say is, I can't back it up today on the show, but I can tell you, the same spirit that's going to be in the clip we're about to show you has been what's driven the people that have put pressure on the UN to come up with this report. And she was under intense pressure to come up with the report she's come up with. So we're going to deal with that in future shows, right? We'll keep our powder dry for now. But the organisation that I went after that gets cited in the UN report is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And they have created the climate of intense China hatred in Australia that A Current Affair decided was important for this story. So, like I said, we're going to play it now, but as you watch it, own it. Because they are pitching it to what they think you want. And if you don't like that, work with us to combat this stuff. But this is Media Watch Monday this week. Media Watch, it was so bad, Media Watch had to do a story on it. What's this?
These are the conflict islands. Conflict by name and potentially conflict by nature.
We are already under siege here.
So come on, Australia. Where the bloody hell are you?
Hello, I'm Paul Barwick. Welcome to Media Watch and to Trouble in Paradise. Last Monday, a current affair alerted us to a national security threat on the conflict islands, an isolated atoll less than 1,000 kilometres from Cairns, with ACA's Steve Marshall telling viewers they're up for sale and we should all be worried.
These privately owned islands are going under the hammer.
They're vacant and they're freehold.
And anyone can buy them.
Yes, anyone. Which is why millionaire owner Ian Gary Smith is offering the Australian government first dibs on all 21 of the islets and warning...
It is heaven, it is, but it's a heaven under threat.
And how so? Because, Mr Gary Smith claims, a foreign buyer could be interested.
Would you be prepared to sell these islands to the Chinese?
Yes, I have to sell the islands.
If a military-minded China moves in...
Perfect for any type of aircraft, fighter jets even.
It'll get plenty of bang for its buck. This opportunity should scare every Aussie.
According to Gary Smith, he contacted Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office in June to warn of this and to offer up the islands at the bargain price of just $25 million US.
Is that a little on the low side?
I have had valuations of up to 100 million.
But he got no reply from the minister.
I haven't heard dicky-boo from them, nothing.
So he went to a current affair and suddenly his tropical paradise had its own TV sales campaign. And a chorus of voices on Sky were getting fired up at the government for ignoring the Chinese threat.
Where's the press conference today from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong? I will just ignore these Chinese incursions once again, will we?
We've now learnt that China is eyeing off purchasing a string of islands just off Papua New Guinea, aptly named the Conflict Islands.
And by the time the Daily Mail was done with the story, the deal was all but sealed, and that foreign power was moving in. Suddenly, the little atoll no one had ever heard of was the hottest property in town, until the Prime Minister was tackled about it by Ben Fordham on 2GB and burst the bubble.
Shouldn't this be in our national security and leaning into regional stability to have a chat to this bloke about buying the islands?
Yeah, there's over 500 in that area, Ben. Over 500. Think about the implications if sellers of assets can, through the media, say, I want Australia to buy this, or else there's implications we'll sell it to China. Think about where that ends.
Where it ends would be with Australia owning an awful lot of islands. Or in this case, with a monumental backdown by Ian Gary Smith, the island's owner, on 9.
How concerned actually are you that China could establish Navy and Air Force footholds there?
I don't think that's a particularly high probability.
What? And not only that, Gary Smith then revealed the Chinese had never expressed interest in the islands, and why would they? Because they're not even on the market.
We're not involved in any discussions with the Chinese at the moment to try and sell to them. The properties are not on the market.
So, what on earth was ACA's exclusive 18-minute story about the Chinese threat all about? We contacted Mr Gary Smith to ask just that, and he confirmed the islands are indeed not on the market, telling Media Watch...
I am seeking to engage in discussions about the future of the islands before the islands are placed on the market. I only went to the media when repeated attempts over 2 months did not get acknowledged.
And what did he think of a current affairs treatment of his story, along with all those menacing Chinese rockets?
There was a serious failure in government communication. If it had been my choice, I would have concentrated more on that, rather than the somewhat less likelihood of the CCP buying it.
But, as we all know, that would have been a far less exciting story.
And just to note that island owner needn't have got into that whole flap about it, because anything like this goes through the Foreign Investment Review Board anyway. It would have come to the government's attention for review.
What a dodgy character that owner is, right? But this, look, you know, we're a separate political party, because we don't like both major parties. A pox on both their houses. But, you know, I'm happy to give credit where it's due to any politician. And Albo's answer to that was gold, right? What a scam. This was an outright scam. Playing on your prejudice. And I'm being very general. If you're one of the viewers that don't have the prejudice, good on you. But too many Australians have this prejudice. And a scammer who wants to sell an island, and a Current Affair, which is a scammer media outlet run by Peter Costello now, right, and the Nine Group, they thought, cha-ching, let's just pretend this is going to be a Chinese invasion. This is as big a scam as Clive Palmer's stupid claims about the airstrip in northern Western Australia. But people got to understand, this is pitched to us because they think we're going to swallow this. Because that's what prejudice does. And why we said this is how wars are started is because it gets very, very dangerous. You can have politicians in Parliament that are just as gullible as the general public, and they walk around there saying, oh man, did you hear about the latest thing? The Chinese have bought these islands off New Guinea, and they're going to launch their invasion from there, right? This is garbage, and that's a tabloid version of it. In coming weeks, we will respond very authoritatively and comprehensively to this UN Human Rights Commission report.
Yep, and our media, etc., they have to stop playing with fire because this is very serious.
The day the missiles come flying, we will think,
it's too late.
Was any of this worth it? Because, Elisa, if half of what they said about China is true, I'd be saying it too. We looked at this in such detail. Almost none of it's true.
Yep. But that detail is available. Get a hold of a copy of our alert service to find out the work that we have done to back all this up, and subscribe to it on a weekly basis so that you're informed.
And please, you'll see the video soon up on our website, up on YouTube, of what I said earlier about councils and the postal bank. It's an 8-minute video. Make sure you watch that and share it with your councillors. And that aside, this coming week, starting Monday, call your Member of Parliament and call the senators in your state and say, go to the Postal Bank Forum. Midday to 1 p.m. Wednesday the 7th in the Senate Committee Room 2S3.
So we should have a very good report next week, next Friday, when we record the next show.
I'll be back on Thursday. You're going to make me do the show on Friday.
Yeah, you'll have something to say, we hope.
I'll be exhausted. All right.
So thanks for that. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.